Hi, and welcome to the TrueWorks podcast, the podcast that helps you understand what the gospel is and how it applies to your life and work. I'm your host, Joshua Smith, and with me today is my co-host, Doug Meikle. Doug, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here and glad you could make it through in one take.
Make it through in one take. That's not often how I do things around here.
No, that's not how you do things. But today was a good day. Yeah,
yes, it was. I just get too nervous around you, Doug, is really the thing.
Appropriately, I would say.
Most people are nervous around you for one reason or another.
Or another, yeah.
And you would be actually wise to be nervous around the guy that we're talking about today, which is Martin Luther and his little tiny work on Christian liberty.
Yeah, on Christian liberty, yeah.
Or sometimes it's titled On the Freedom of the Christian.
Yeah.
Why would you be wise to be nervous? Well, Luther, he wore his passions on his sleeve.
He did indeed, yeah.
And when he liked you, you knew. And when he didn't like you,
you certainly knew that too.
Really knew.
Yes, you really knew that too.
The things that he called the papacy are some of the most colorful language that you can find in theology.
Yes, colorful language. Yeah,
and we'll just leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. Yeah. Yeah, and there's actually lots and lots of his works recorded. He has tens of volumes of his table talk, of the quick chats he would have around his kitchen table with his family and others who came to visit. And
which is extraordinary to think that those were conversations around the table. I mean...
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But it's also in those where he typically says things that are less than flattering about the Catholic Church hierarchy of his day. Yeah.
And the work that we're looking at for the Faith Work Intensive is not really on the papacy or the hierarchy, but on kind of our status before God and how that then influences how we relate to Him, but importantly, how we relate to others as well.
To the community at large.
Yeah. And the kind of dual position that we have now, which, again, as so many of our authors in the intensive, is so relatable.
Yeah.
It's so relatable.
So relatable, yeah.
What I'm referring to is comes from Romans 7, where Paul says, why do I do the things that I do not want to do? Even as believers, we find ourselves, even if we're astute believers, and recognizing that our salvation is secure by Christ, we find ourselves, just like St. Paul, battling and embattled with sin. Yeah. This can be it has been and continues to be sometimes a pretty discouraging. Well, why am I doing this? Yeah. And Luther, as an Augustinian monk, he was quite attuned to his own psyche and the desires and sins of his heart. Yeah. And this was a huge battle for him. But what he's going to tell us in this little book is the status of your redemption before God is not dependent upon what you're seeing in those kind of dispositions and desires.
Yeah.
So it's
part
incredible.
Of the thing, yeah. I mean, I think he has a basic insight about that I think is helpful to us, and but it's also, I think, worth noting that one of the reasons that the Bible, for example, has such a profound effect on people is that it begins, like in that passage from St. Paul there, from observing things that we all have access to. Right, that tension in one's life between, hey, I know what I want to do, but I just seem unable to do it. Mm-hmm. That's something that is pretty much universal. Everybody has some access to that emotion or that feeling or that predicament in their life. Mm-hmm. And so for that's something that's reflected there for St. Paul, but it's also something that was pretty central to the whole kind of psyche of Martin Luther, is that how can I be justified and righteous before God when I'm this wretched sinner?
I'm constantly dealing with these things. And one of the interesting things about Luther's life as he goes to become a monk through this crazy kind of episode of being caught in a storm and committing himself, promising if God saves him from the perils of the storm that he would commit to this lifelong pursuit, that he found that, okay, I'm going to try to get away from the world so that I'm not caught up in its own desires and going towards sin. And what he found is when he took away the world, the sin was crouching at the door.
Yeah.
Perhaps even more virulent, more intense than when he was out there, because now he is left just with himself.
Just with himself. And of course, just with himself, many of the problems that, if not all of the problems that he experienced so intensely, they came with him, of course, to the world of being a monk. And his incredible desire was to be pure before God, justified before God, righteous before God. And he did all those, as he called them, monkish things. If ever a monk could earn his way into heaven by monkish things, he said it would have been Martin Luther, because he did all those things. But ultimately, in his search for righteousness, he realized that the key issue, the key insight for him was that the righteousness was not to be found sort of in him or in his obedience. Righteousness, as it's talked about in the Bible, comes from the outside, granted to us, given to us, and that's its power. It's not something we earn or something find somehow internally. It's something that's given to us by God as a gift. Yeah.
And this external receiving of this gift, his insight is also in what happens once the gift is received.
Yeah.
Because, and we're not going to get into like the deep nuances of the theology, but one of the key insights is that once you receive that gift, there is this simultaneous identity that you are just now because of receiving something from the outside, God acting on you, but also still continually a sinner.
Yeah.
And thanks be to God that he counts it your righteousness from Christ as what determines your eternal destiny and not this continuing battle.
Yeah. And I think there for Luther also, there's a very practical observation there. It's an observation of one's experience that with St. Paul is that even when God grants that gift of righteousness to you, the experience of real life is that you are both, that you have this dual existence between being just and being sinner, and that the resolution of that will only come in the end of time or the end of our Christian time. And but in the meantime, that's something you just have to live with.
Yeah,
you have to live with and recognize. Yeah,
which initially that may lead you to despair. That, and I think it did initially for Luther too. That when you turn inward, it's screaming, your psyche, your heart, your actions, your desires are screaming, you're a sinner, you have fallen.
Yeah.
You have these things that you desire, but you cannot do them. And then this is a course for a Christian, right? Yeah. And not only for Luther, but as he looks to St. Paul, it's the Saint Paul. We think he's a saint because he was doing these great things, but even he has these struggles of fighting his old nature. And it gives me so much comfort coming to the end of that chapter in Romans. Paul says, "Who will save me from this body of death? Thanks be to God for Jesus Christ."
Yeah.
It's in the trust, in shifting back and forth. The whole Christian life is not essentially God making you just, but you identifying yourself again and again with the justice that God has declared on you.
Yeah. I think there's another, for the folks going through the Faith and Work Intensive, there's another kind of practical element of this, or at least related to Martin Luther's life.
Okay.
That kind of illustrates the point. Martin Luther had struggled with his mental health. Throughout his life.
Yeah.
He had these bouts of serious darkness and depression through his whole life. I think the German word for them, Anfechtungen, and periods of darkness and disorientation, and he would that went through his whole life. In fact, it's possible that folks look at that he may have been some kind of bipolar.
Yeah,
he's bipolar.
Yeah, I've heard that as well.
That he had these periods of immense productivity followed by periods of incredible darkness, and he struggled with through his whole life. But interestingly for Luther, because he did not have the same therapeutic frame that we have today, he talks about how those moments and the struggles through those moments are what ultimately made him a theologian, ultimately made him a Christian witness to some extent. Not that those would... His view is that he did not necessarily want those to not come. The coming of those moments and the struggle through was ultimately for him that what is the kind of fire that forged him. And I think for many people today, who suffer, and it's certainly in these last 2 or 3 years that we've gone through uptick in mental health deterioration, I think Luther's story is one where, even in those moments, one can fight through. I don't want to kind of belittle that or make that sound like that's not a real issue, but for Luther it was something that he fought his way through, and it formed his personality, and he felt was a positive part of his personality ultimately.
And because he was so attuned to that he could not trust his own ability to somehow respond to God's grace in order for his redemption to be complete. And
so that's a great point, actually, Joshua, because those moments were instructive to him at multiple levels, one of which was that he couldn't trust himself and his own decision making, but two, also that God is the one who can redeem even those situations, right? So going through that for him was this incredibly formative thing. And he would return there many times during his life. I mean, this was not something that happened once.
Yeah, it wasn't just one episode.
It was one episode. No, it was something that was with him his entire life.
So we've talked about this duality, which I think is perhaps the most relatable theme that he notes in the work. Now let's talk about this other subject of what, now that we kind of have this identity, this dual identity, simultaneously just and sinner, what that does to how we interact with the world, specifically people, but also I want to talk about work. Could you bring up perhaps that other theme of what this now does with who we're obligated to in our freedom, and kind of give some insight to the title?
So the way that, again, there's this kind of dual nature, and the way that Luther explains it is that, again, it's kind of unpacking this kind of dual character that we have here as Christian people on this earth, is that, as he says, because Christ died for us, we are at the same time, again, that statement, at the same time, we are at the same time the most free person in all creation. Because our burdens have been taken away. We know who we are. We know what the start is. We know what the end is. So again, we've talked about this in other podcasts. Therefore, there's this kind of freedom of action. We can do whatever we want. But then he says, wait, at the very same time, because of that freedom almost, we're also obligated to our fellow man. Because of what God has done for us, we are a slave almost, and obligated to our fellow human being. Those who work in the communities around us, we are to serve them. So we are at the same time the most free person in the world, but also the most obligated as Christians to serve our local communities. Again, that kind of dual character.
He's very, when you get into his politics, he's quite dualistic, but dualistic, we don't mean that in a negative.
Not in the philosophical sense necessarily.
But in this, we can't simply boil all this down to one kind of thing. That's not what the human experience is.
No. And I think if there's something about Luther that I think is really good, is that he is this incredibly grounded human being, and that makes him sometimes not the easiest guy to be around, but he's definitely grounded in the experience of his people and the folks that lived around him. Very, very much so. So this is not some kind of highfalutin philosophical thing for him. It's very much in the lives and purposes of the people with which he lived and served every day. That's what he's all about.
Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the freedom that he talks about. Why is it that we are free? It has something to do with this kind of fundamental need that has been secured.
Yeah.
And therefore, everything else that we do, like the pressure's off.
Yeah, the pressure is off.
And that's where this freedom comes from. So we have to be careful. Martin Luther is writing in the 15th and 16th century, 15th, I guess. And when we hear freedom, we have different connotation with it. Freedom
so
means,
Luther would never have thought that freedom means a complete no obligations to others. Right. That's not freedom for him.
That's chaos.
That's chaos.
Something.
A complete autonomy of action. And in fact, Luther, in his life, argued extensively against chaos and freedom without obligation. So for him, it's not you just get to do anything you want, but you have this free, but at the same time, you do have this open field of action that's available to you.
And in that, one of the things that in our modern predicament, freedom kind of means this laissez-faire, do whatever you want. But that's because we associate that kind of unrestraint with satisfaction in what would be the best life.
Yeah.
But Luther has a completely different view of what humanity, what man is. And if humanity's put in this kind of laissez-faire, all strings are unattached, that doesn't give you fulfillment and flourishing. That gives you chaos.
Yeah. No, you need to think that, it's certainly everybody up to and including all of the Reformation writers, they just do not have that modern frame. It's not even in their horizon that if only one, they would never think if only one could get oneself into the position where I had complete and utter self-autonomy with no obligations to others, that would be this perfect state, or that would be the state of being that I would most enjoy. There is no one who would write in and around the Reformation that statement and feel it had any meaning at all. Because life for them existed in the relationships they had with others. Which again for Luther was also, it manifested in the importance of work. The importance of work, because work was not simply a product. It was also an obligation to the rest of the members in your community. For some common shared good that we're all a part of. And I think because there is this kind of view of freedom and absolute autonomy, this self-directedness that separates us from Luther, when we now take in our modern self, this view that we are only satisfied when we are completely no strings attached. When we take that into communal work, we find that there's something disconnected. The whole thing breaks down.
We're disconnected from our environment, with our fellow man, and of course, here at TrueWorks, ultimately from God. But Luther has this way of saying, we're most free, but we're simultaneously most obligated. And that has tremendous resources for those who are going in the faith work intensive of how we're supposed to view our work. Could you maybe unpack that?
The anecdote, of course, that everybody quotes, or they quote various versions of this, of a shoemaker at some point going up to Martin Luther and asking him, "Hey, how should I make shoes as a Christian?" And he just simply turned around and said, "Make good shoes and sell them at good prices." And that was enough for him. The nature of that work is such that obligation that one can have just to simply do one's craft well and sell it to others for a fine price, I think ultimately is something for him that fulfilled these kind of these biblical obligations to love one's neighbor. It was a very practical way of living out the loving of one's neighbor in a way that God had given you the skill to do so, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's something, again, where you can take that into your modern frame and say, how can I execute my work in such a way that makes the living in this community better? And I think just simply asking that question is a challenge to many, because they can't articulate their work in that way, many modern people. In fact, most of the folks that go through the Faith and Work Intensive, they start from a place where they really don't have a sense of how can I articulate my work in a way that it makes sense to the broader community. And yeah, that's a challenge for them.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, a product of our kind of modern compartmentalization, specialization that's given us many benefits. It's necessary for the kind of sophisticated work we do. But when you lose the forest through the trees, Martin Luther has his thumb on the forest. And so hopefully through community in the Faith Work Intensive and through reading these ancient writers who don't share a lot of our presupposition, they can show us anew this forest.
No, and I think that's very important, and I think it's why we introduce people in this course to writers that are kind of pre-Enlightenment, and the reason for that is because they have a perspective that I think that can well critique our modern world. The obligations we have to each other that are kind of embedded in the scriptures and embedded in the Christian view of the world and articulated by these Christian saints over time is something that can really help us open our eyes to the predicament we find ourselves in today, where there's a lack of the sense of the common good or common grace or commonwealth. These terms, if you like, that were framed in our Christian in a Christian world and were used to define how we interact with each other, even politically. How do we interact with each other that we might flourish together in the creation that God's given us?
So foreign.
Yeah, it's just totally foreign from us today.
Yeah, so
and I think the only thing we can ask is that we, of the folks in the Faith and Work Intensive, is just something that they re-examine some of those things as well. So that would be one element. I think I want to suggest another element too, is that, hey, if you want to find purpose in your work, if you want to see the purpose in your work, then that process of reframing it, like, how does this work contribute to the health of my community? I think that's an important framing for them. I think that we have many doctors, or many medical professionals, I should say. We have a whole gamut of folks that go through this Faith and Work Intensive simply because of our location here in Houston. What we find there is that those folks find it very easy to get a sense of this is a vocation that's kind of godly in its sense.
What's not good about
healing people, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's not good about that, and that's great. But with the real challenge, and see, Martin Luther, he had a sense of who the guy who made shoes could have that same sense. That if I don't make, as a medical professional, if I don't make good shoes, people go without shoes.
Yeah.
If I make bad shoes, then folks who are largely poor get one pair of shoes a year, and those shoes don't last for that year, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
I think he had a sense of all of these roles in society together form this tapestry of work that allow the community to flourish, and each and every person has that part to play. One of the things we say about the Faith and Work Intensive is that what we want to try and get folks to do is find their version of make good shoes at a good price. And that there is an equivalent to that in insurance, in human resources, or in carpentry, or in all these different roles that we have in our working world. That's what you're looking for, because we talked about Augustine a week or so ago, and that sense of doing something for the community and finding your purpose and meaning in something, helping you, thinking about how do you articulate the meaning of your work in the way that can support and help the local community. hopefully gives you that longer term view. You know, your work is not something that clears out at the end of every month with a paycheck, where all accounts are settled at the end of every month. But it is something that can transcend that and give meaning to your life.
And again, we have this dual nature that's not just Luther, but it's reality, right? That and Christians have been guilty of kind of going beyond the particulars, thinking that only that which is spiritual or eternal is important. And of course it is, but the particular things, the shoes, so to speak, or the insurance or the bottom line or the monthly reports are given meaning, are given eternal significance in various degrees because of their relationship to that more transcendent meaning. But Christians have been guilty, and I think Luther was pushing up against the trends in the in the medieval church, where it's like all the particulars and the things on the ground, so to speak, the terrestrial, the earthy, they were disregarded. And Luther, just from his reading of the scriptures, but also experience of life, said no. You know?
And yes, I think Luther. It's easy to. What's the right word for this? I think you have to understand Luther set against what he's trying to achieve and who his opposition is. It's like Luther. You can understand Luther better if you got a little bit of an understanding of what the medieval church was like and what he had to deal with, and in effect the taxes that were levied on the medieval European community. If you go to visit St. Peter's Basilica, I guess, in Rome, I've been there, very beautiful. But that building was built from the taxes that were levied on the people of medieval Europe that Luther was so against. You know, so for him, one issue was that, you know, the dignity of work was such that he did not want that dignity of work to be robbed by people being taxed, in effect, by the church to send stuff outside of their local community as well. So there's very much in Luther a strand of, it seems to me at least, a strand of this kind of community of pushing back against this authority that was divorced from the people, you know.
That didn't have perhaps some of the interest or the greatest flourishing of the people
of those local people in mind.
Yeah.
No, they people being used instead of served.
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's a good place to wrap up, and hopefully it gives you some framework, some orientation, some motivation to open this little work of Luther on Christian liberty yourself. Thank you again for joining us for the TrueWorks podcast, where we examined Luther's on Christian liberty. Hopefully we gave you some ideas, some frameworks to look at it yourself. If you'd like to hear other podcasts by TrueWorks, we are available on all platforms, or if you would like to visit us on our website, visit us at trueworkshouston.org.